Hello everyone, and it's time to talk about mutations. When things happen in the genetic code that leaves an organism looking slightly different from the other members of its species. So, a mutation happens when an organism has an abnormal genetic sequence. So when the nucleotides that we discussed are in a different order than they would normally be in a member of that species, perhaps because of a mistake in the replication of DNA. Mutations cannot really be fixed, or at least not yet by us, but sometimes they are a good thing, and very often they are certainly not a bad thing. But how do they happen? So, as we said, DNA replicates itself billions of times every year, so you expect there will be a copying error eventually. DNA can also be damaged, and therefore mutated, by chemicals and radiation. Mutations can happen at the chromosome level or the gene level, and it usually begins in just one cell nucleus, but if that cell then divides, the mutation will get more and more common in the cells of the organism. So mutations can occur naturally, just walking around outside. We have sunlight shining on us, and that can lead to a mutation. Rocks are sometimes naturally a little bit radioactive, and that can cause mutation. So the risk of mutation is increased by different types of nuclear radiation, alpha, beta or gamma, and these increase the risk in different ways. It can also be increased by having X-rays or ultraviolet light, not just sunlight. But these are the highest frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum, so they are high energy waves. That means they can damage our cells. And certain chemicals also cause mutations, which we call as a group mutagens, chemicals that can mutate you. If the mutation is usually cancer, then we have another name for those chemicals. We call them carcinogens. So most mutations are likely to be harmful. If a mutation occurs in a gamete, then a baby born from that cell may have serious birth abnormalities. Just as an aside, you might also hear the term birth defects, which is still used, but when saying defect, you are implying there is something wrong with an object, or in this case, an organism. And this can be insensitive if used in the wrong context. So if a mutation occurs in body cells, however, then these might lead to reproduction of cells getting out of control, and this is what we call cancer. There are other ways that mutations can influence an organism in body cells, of course. So as an example, let's talk about trisomy. Trisomy is a group of genetic mutations where 3 of a certain type of chromosome end up in the zygote of a reproducing organism. So there are many forms of trisomy. We will have a quick look at some of the most common, and in spite of our light-hearted little graphic there, it's quite a serious subject. So trisomy 21, for example, is also known as Down syndrome, and this is quite common to see in everyday life because the people who have it, although they have some physical and mental impairments, they can live relatively normal lives, although they often need additional care and die younger than other people. Other kinds of trisomy will cause more problems to the development of a fetus, and so Down syndrome people are the most likely to lead some kind of normal life, with one exception, and those are the people who have a duplicate of chromosome 23. Those are the sex chromosomes, and those are another kind of trisomy. So, in sex chromosomal trisomy, you can have XXY, which is also known as Klinefelter syndrome, and men who have an extra X chromosome, which is what this is, will be slightly more feminine than normal, and they may be less able to have children. XX women are mostly normal. They have a few small physical differences that sometimes, but don't always, show. And then XYY men. There are men who have an additional Y chromosome, and they too are mostly normal, although they may be taller than average. There was a hypothesis that extra Y chromosome men are more aggressive than normal men, but this has largely been shown to lack evidence to support it. And again, as an aside, my use of the word normal is for convenience, but in all of these situations you often hear the question asked, what exactly is normal? So there's one more thing to look at, and that's monosomy X, which is not a trisomy, and if you think about this you will be able to work out why. These are women who are generally normal, but you can find that they are prone to a list of additional health problems throughout their lives. If you think about that and what we've talked about in previous modules, you might be able to work out why. So, as I've suggested a couple of times, there are a lot of ethical questions associated with genetic mutations and genetic modifications. Our understanding of genetics has grown hugely over the last 50 years or so, and now we can diagnose genetic mutations in embryos. This means that a pregnancy can be ended if the baby will be abnormal, that is, if they will have serious problems developing into a normal, healthy organism. But what is abnormal? And if we can know that a baby will be seriously mutated, should we end the pregnancy? Are we ethically allowed to? Are we ethically obliged to? This is a very difficult question, and it highlights the importance of thinking about our ethics before we decide what science to conduct. And once science has allowed certain technologies to be possible, we then have to think about how we as a culture want to use those technologies in an ethical way. So, we've talked a little about potentially negative mutations, but if you give DNA a billion years, it can do amazing things with mutations, and this is what we call evolution. And these are also beneficial mutations, mutations that are good for an organism. So very occasionally, a mutation will give an organism a survival advantage, and this is called natural selection, because no one ever chose to let that organism reproduce. The organism with a survival advantage is more likely to pass on that genetic advantage to its young, and over millions of years this is more likely to lead to that survival advantage becoming normal for that species. So one example of evolution at work is in antibiotic-resistant bacteria. If you take a course of antibiotics and a few bacteria survive, then those bacteria obviously have the genes to survive antibiotics. when those bacteria reproduce, they will pass that resistance on. All of the bacteria that were killed by the antibiotics do not pass on their lack of resistance. So we should point out that last mutation is really beneficial for the bacteria and might be really bad for us. We need to be very careful about how we use them, otherwise antibiotics may stop working and then we could face a serious disease problem. So here are good examples of natural selection. A blue budgerigar mutated from a yellow budgerigar. Now, this overall is a neutral effect. There is no change to survival chance. So blue budgerigars have survived, but they are not more likely to survive than yellow budgerigars. But an example where coloration does make a difference, the dark grey peppered moths were rare, but became common when we had a lot of pollution in our cities, because the pollution killed the lichen on the trees and the lighter speckled moths were easy to spot on the polluted trees. So all effects like this start from a mutation. So here you can see the effect of those speckled moths on the lichen covered trees and the non-covered trees. And scientists have followed the population of these black moths and saw them increasing as cities became more polluted. But now, as we have stopped using a lot of dirty fuels and the cities have cleaned up, the lichen has returned to the trees, and the light moths, which you can hardly see on the left-hand picture, they have returned to become the majority in many places. Well, that about wraps us up, but one more thing, monosomy X, just to let you know, is when a female is born with just one X chromosome. So technically she would be genetically incomplete, but because the X chromosome has still got all of its genes, that means that it is viable for an egg to grow with just one X chromosome. The Y chromosome cannot code for a complete organism, so it cannot exist on its own. But the women who are born with a single X chromosome will have more health problems on average, because all of their recessive genes that might carry health problems associated with them will always be expressed. There is no chance that they have a dominant healthy gene on their second chromosome, because they don't have a second 23rd chromosome. So that's why they are more prone to certain health problems.